Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We are about to get started on our Decolonizing the Shoreline event here. Nice to see everyone. Wow, we have quite a number of people joining us today. That is excellent. It's really incredible to see how much support is being provided to incorporating Indigenous knowledge into all aspects of our planning. And of course, our guests that we have with us today, we're so lucky to have the folks joining us. Welcome, everyone. So my name is Ginger Gosnell-Myers. I am Niska and Kwakwaka'wakw. I'm at the Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue. I'm an Indigenous fellow focusing on decolonization and urban Indigenous planning and policy. I'm coming to you from the unceded homelands of the Squamish people. I live in the Squamish community of Eslaon. Most people know it as North Vancouver or Lower Lonsdale. I know that we have people joining us from all across the province of BC, as well as North America. So welcome wherever you are. Of course, we are a day after the summer solstice, and here in Canada, we just celebrated National Indigenous Peoples Day. Hello to all of the fathers out there as well. We just celebrated Father's Day, and we are in the year of the Salish Sea as well. This is an incredible initiative that is helping to promote our understanding of ocean-centered planning and activities for those of us who live along the coast of the Salish Sea. The event, Decolonizing the Shoreline, is a collaboration between the Simon Fraser University Center for Dialogue and also the City of Vancouver. You will see that we do have ASL supports and closed captioning available for our event today. So closed captioning is available. To turn the closed captioning on or off, please navigate to the bottom of your Zoom screen and select live transcript. We do have ASL support also available at this session. You will see our interpreters named interpreter on the screen. Thank you so much for our interpreters for being available with us today. We have a number of esteemed speakers with us today. Decolonizing the Shoreline is really an effort to help us understand how First Nations and Indigenous knowledge here in British Columbia, primarily Northern British Columbia, have really been leading the charge for ocean health, for shoreline health, for advocacy on Indigenous rights, Indigenous fishing rights, and how this is really transforming the landscape of ocean protection, ocean health, water stewardship, Indigenous knowledge for shoreline planning. And for those of us who fall within the realm of urban planners, landscape architects, emergency response planners, bringing Indigenous knowledge into shoreline planning is quite new. We're in this transformation here in Canada because of the connections to reconciliation, to fostering reconciliation in this country. And it's incredibly important that we start looking at how we can bring Indigenous knowledge into all aspects of our work in our lives. When it comes to shoreline planning, this is absolutely essential because we are in the midst of a climate emergency. Many coastal communities are planning for sea level rise. The speakers that we have with us today are directly addressing a number of the key considerations, cultural considerations that need to be thought of for the work ahead of us. And so we have with us Chief Dr. Frank Brown from the Heiltsuk Nation of Bella Bella. Frank is an adjunct professor in resource and environmental management at Simon Fraser University. He is also one of the founders of the Indigenous Guardians training program with Coastal First Nations. Really honored to have Frank with us today. We also have Christine Smith-Martin, who is from the Tsimshian and Haida Nations. Christine is the CEO of Coastal First Nations and the Great Bear Initiative, also a very important leader for coastal health and leadership here in BC. We also have Joanne Nelson with us. Joanne is a Tsimshian woman who is a PhD candidate at UBC, focusing on urban Indigenous leadership and ocean governance, who is currently also working with Coastal First Nations, so working with Christine, working with Frank. And last but not least, we have Corey Douglas with us. Corey Douglas is a Squamish Nation member with Haida and Tsimshian ancestry. His experience is deeply rooted in art and architectural design. He is currently the cultural advisor for the City of Vancouver's Sea to City Design Competition. And the Sea to City Design Competition is really what is bringing us together right now. I will be introducing the lead for the Sea to City Design Challenge, Angela Daniluk. She is a biologist with the City of Vancouver. The Sea to City Design Challenge has been really looking at transforming the waterfront using a variety of techniques. And so I will welcome Angela to just provide us with an overview of the work that she is doing. Welcome, Angela.
Thanks, Ginger. Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everyone and get settled in today. I'm calling in from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and the sun is out, which is really nice at this time of year for Vancouver. Vancouver is a coastal city, and like many coastal cities, it's vulnerable to sea level rise and coastal flooding. So the city has been learning about this sea level rise and coastal flood hazards for the last 10 years, and we are planning for a future with sea level rise. The Sea to City Design Challenge aims to create new ideas for our shoreline, as well as raise awareness about sea level rise and climate change. In the past, and I would say even in the current, the dominant thinking around coastal adaptation planning has been very hard in solving for just one or two things. We need to flip that. We need to learn from Indigenous peoples, from knowledge keepers and elders, and reimagine our shoreline where not only the land and waters are restored, but also our relationships with each other and our relationships to the land. And so I hope you'll take some time to really listen and learn and unlearn from the panelists today. And thank you very much for attending.
Thank you, Angela. We have the opportunity for you to ask questions of our panelists. You'll see at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A function. You'll be able to put in your questions for folks, and we will be addressing them as we go on. So please feel free to reach out to us with your questions. We are going to get started. We have a very simple format for our dialogue today. We are going to first hear from Frank talking about the deep history of Indigenous leadership, coastal leadership here in the province. And then we're going to move through to some of our other guests. And so I think all of our panelists are here right now. If we can show everybody's faces on our main screens here. Hoping this works. Zoom, isn't it great? It can still always surprise us and put us in situations where we're hoping that tech will get sorted out effectively. Frank, Frank, I see that you are here with us. Thank you. I'm glad that you're able to make it. Frank, we're just so incredibly inspired by the work that you've been doing with the Heiltsuk people and the work that you have led in stewarding so much of our coastal efforts for First Nations along the coast. I'm wondering if you can introduce yourself and share some of the work that you've been doing over the last, well, number of years. You've been doing this for a long time.
Thank you, Ginger. Yo Nugwa Glagliasila. My chief's name is Glagliasila from the Heiltsuk Nation from Bella Bella. I bring you greetings from Bella Bella. The sun is also shining here. It's very nice. But I understand we're also in for another heat dome. And so that's an indication of the issues that we've been facing lately. Heat domes, ocean acidification, the decline of herring and salmon most recently. And as Native people of this coastline, we have been a witness to the boom and bust of the resource exploitation that first came to our shores when they recognized the value of the sea otter pelts. And then it was timber and then seafood. And I think we're really dealing with a challenging issue and have to come to the realization that we have to look at things in a different way, in a more sustainable way. And what the Native people of this land have to offer is a worldview and a system of governance that has sustained us for millennia. And people always, want to know how and why. And the evidence speaks for itself. According to carbon dating, the Heiltsuk people specifically have been in our homelands for the past 14,000 years, or over 700 generations. Canada as a nation state is 153 years old, to put it into some perspective. Our people were here when the earth was covered by ice, when saber-toothed tigers roamed the earth along with giant sloths on this part of the continent. And our people moved up the inlets and cultivated river systems by transplanting salmon from salmon-bearing to non-bearing salmon streams and clam gardens. And so we were keen agriculturalists. And that's a common history along this great coast. And so we have come to understand our place through this long history. We've established laws, and the colonial forces that were imposed upon us have had a devastating impact, not only on our society and the impacts of colonization, but on our environments. And for Western science to be effective, they really need baseline data. And the baseline data that exists is in intact ecosystems, because you can't manage properly if you don't have the baseline, the ecological baseline. And so we recognize currently that it is in fact the cities that consolidate the economic and political power and the populations and influence, and in fact are the ones that absorb most of the natural resources out in these rural areas. And so the Native people are the ones that live in this environment and see what's going on. Honestly, a lot of people that live in the urban environments are disconnected from the ocean. And so we have something to offer. Our worldview and our lived experiences intergenerationally, we've advanced the Guardian programs across the country from 20 programs to over 80. We're supporting Canada to achieve its international obligations for biodiversity conservation to address climate change through establishing Indigenous protected and conserved areas. And we have a lot to offer, and I'm glad that we have an opportunity to participate in this call. I want to thank the WASC Center for Dialogue and the City of Vancouver for being open to having this conversation. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yep, thank you, Frank. You know, you really provided us with this, like a very succinct overview of how much work Indigenous nations have done on our coastal shorelines over the thousands of years, and how much knowledge is really reflected through this relationship. I want to turn it over to Christine now, because there's a really key connection between the history that Frank talked about and a lot of the advocacy for Indigenous knowledge to be brought into ocean health management and fisheries management. Frank mentioned the establishment of the Indigenous Guardians program. And so Christine, at Coastal First Nations, you really are the one implementing. What does it mean to action this in our modern contemporary society today?
Thank you, Ginger. Thank you for having me here today. My name is Christine Smith-Martin, and I'm the CEO of Coastal First Nations. My Haida name is Hatjela, which means Haida dancer. I come from the Yachlanis clan, and my grandmother was Lavina White. I'm also Tsimshian. I was born and raised in a small coastal community called Lakwa Alams. And I really do want to thank you for having this very interesting conversation today. And just a little bit about Coastal First Nations. It's a unique alliance of 9 communities. That's Old Masset, Skidegate, the Council of Haida Nation, Metlakatla, Kitkatla, Hartley Bay, Wekino, Helschuk, Kitasoo, and New Hulk. And it's been an alliance for just over 20 years now. And I just want to sort of back up. Before we came along, there has been a traditional alliance along the coast long before Coastal First Nations came along. It really just sort of solidified us working together. It's been an interesting, you know, our members and our communities encompass probably 88 square kilometers of marine ecosystems. And we've been stewards of this land for quite some time now. We have done it very effectively. I remember my grandparents talking about the abundance of fish, the abundance of moose, all of those species that they used to gather. So I think it's really important to remember that we've always, as Indigenous people, sustained ourselves, and we only took what we needed. And so I think when we're talking about our communities along the coast, that has never wavered. We've always been there to take care of our territories. It is our responsibility to do that. Not only the oceans, but also the forests and all of the animals and mammals that depend on us to protect the ocean and the forests. And I think everybody can remember probably seeing a lot of whales that are showing up on the shores, and a lot of bears are coming out of hibernation that don't quite have enough food. And it's just a really scary time. And I think our communities have been voicing this for quite some time, because in their traditional territories, they see it immediately. It's been a little bit frustrating to, you know, see the decline, and we have the answers. We have the answers in all of our communities. Coastal First Nations communities all have stewardship offices within their nations themselves. And the stewardship offices are wonderful. They go out onto the ocean every day collecting data, ensuring that we're watching for trends, making most of the time, the places that they're going, DFO isn't going because they just don't have the capacity to do that. So it's our responsibility anyway. We're out there and collecting that data and making sure that we're making informed decisions. And if there isn't data, we share that data so that they can make good decisions when it comes to fishing. And it's an interesting topic today, the decolonization of the shoreline. And I think when I think about our communities, I think we've been doing this way for quite some time. We haven't changed the way that we manage our territories. I think what's changed now, which has been interesting, is that, you know, all the things that we've been saying, they're now coming back saying they might be right. And it's kind of ironic they say they might be right, because we know our territories best. We know exactly where you could fish, where you can't fish. We know what to watch out for, when to harvest. So all of these components, I think it's a very interesting time now with COVID coming, that people are really looking at the climate crisis that's happening now and sort of looking at our communities to actually start beginning to have those conversations of what do you think we need to do in order to get us out of this. So I just wanted to share that. It's been an interesting time, but a really great time to be able to talk about these amazing components of our community. And we don't just look at it as ocean. We look at it as ocean is connected to the terrestrial, to the forest. Those are connected to the mammals and the animals. So they're all interconnected. So when we talk about our food sources, we're talking about the ocean and the forest as well. So, and I think a lot of these communities, our communities anyway, they have a very intensive marine planning process. And a lot of those processes, whether it's on the forest and the ocean, they involve elders, they involve communities, and they also involve scientists. So they have a really holistic approach to each of them and very thoughtful in how they develop these processes. So I just wanted to share that this morning. I really do thank you for bringing this topic up. I think it's just such an excellent way to have a good conversation. And I know that, you know, one of the things that we're very, very proud of at Coastal First Nations and all of our communities is developing an efficient and world-class network of guardians. Joanne, she works, you know, making sure that the training continues to happen with our guardians. We have scientists that are working with our guardians. We have technology, app technology that is a tracker, tracks all the species that they're looking at. So it's quite an elaborate process, and we're very, very, very proud of that.
Yeah, I think that, you know, a lot of people who aren't paying attention to First Nations leadership, coastal leadership, would be surprised to hear how sophisticated and efficient this management and monitoring and governance on the water is, and how, you know, as both, you know, Chief Brown and Christine have been mentioning, like, this is not something that has, you know, just cropped up overnight. This has been going on, you know, since time immemorial, and that we are finally producing the types of outcomes at a Western scientific level that First Nations have been talking about for a long time. And this is a really nice segue over to Joanne, because, you know, we're really talking about, you know, the processes that are in place to ensure that water governance and these partnerships are there, they're strong, they're providing us with those larger networks that we need and processes to ensure that this continues to work well over the long term. And the other great thing that Joanne brings to this conversation is that she isn't just focusing on water governance, but what are the urban Indigenous contexts and practices that we can look at in cities. And so Joanne, I'm sure you have a lot to say, you know, just stemming off of what we've heard from Chief Brown and Christine so far.
Yeah, this has been a great segue. This is very smooth in terms of all of the speakers. My name is Joanne Nelson. I'm Tsimshian. My mother was Della Nelson from Loch Lambs. And my father recently passed, was from Kitsum Kalem, Charlie Nelson. And I'm a Whale clan. I don't have a traditional name. I lived in Vancouver for 30 years, up until just a few years ago. So I was living on unceded Coast Salish territory, and I was very honored to be living on Coast Salish territory for such a long time, for 30 years. And in that 30 years, I went down there for university and stayed, as a lot of people do, in the urban environment, and was really humbled to see and witness Coast Salish traditions, humbled to be a part of the dance group that Christine started, and to be part of culture making in East Vancouver, especially for urban Indigenous people. Through my career, after having my undergrad, my graduate master's degree, I was looking for other challenges. I don't know why. I thought a PhD program was a great idea, but I did. And mostly because, working in public health for so long, it was very frustrating for me to see that the voices of urban Indigenous people just weren't present in policy. They just weren't present in like meetings and anything to do with deciding a way forward for us as Indigenous people. Especially in regards to environmental knowledges, traditional knowledges, anything traditional. It seems as though dominant society has this idea that once we cross over into the city or leave the reserve, magically we don't have any more, any more knowledge of our culture and so forth. So that really frustrated me. So I decided to go back and do my PhD in water governance. And for a long time, I struggled to what exactly I was going to do, and decided to draw upon my strengths as an urban Indigenous person. So my research has focused on engaging with urban Indigenous people in the realm of water governance using arts-based methods. So this time last year, I was on a sharing circle and a co-learning journey with participants. And we had come together to discuss our knowledge, our water knowledge and our water governance knowledge and our own traditions. And we expressed that in terms of photography, beadwork, poetry. One lady did a couple of TikTok videos where she was dancing by, an urban water source. And I must say the Pacific Association of First Nations Women was doing so much great work over the pandemic, engaging urban Indigenous people in terms of language and culture and that sort of thing. So I partnered with them, and there should be a link coming up. Oh yeah, it's in the chat. It's about Anishinaabe water law. And that was a project undertaken by Pacific Association of First Nations Women for urban Indigenous people who were interested in learning the Anishinaabe language. And that video shows people, a lovely lady who has since passed on to the spirit world, sharing her understandings of water. And she was in Squamish, the Squamish area. And if you get a chance, please go see the video. It's only 3.5 minutes long. And it's lovely, and it just shows the strength of urban Indigenous matriarchs that continue to care for the water, despite the fact that they're guests on another nation's territory. So that's the research that I did last year via Zoom during our heat dome. So I was honored that so many people came out, with fans beside them and trying to find cool, weather and cool, temperatures so they could participate in, our research circle. And it was fabulous, and we got a lot out of it. There's so much willingness for urban Indigenous people to participate in important things like protecting water for future generations. And I must say also the city of Vancouver was a very, very huge supporter of my research this time last year and have been unrelentingly positive about the work that we did. So I must thank them as well. And just some other things like for urban Indigenous people, and our culture that we developed in East Vancouver, I would say that we were the original people that did land acknowledgements. We've always acknowledged that we are visitors on another nation's unceded territories. And we've always thanked those nations for allowing us to practice our culture and languages on their territories, and to also contribute. And, you know, it was my job as someone, Tsimshian, living on Coast Salish territory to uphold Coast Salish values as to the best of my ability and as a good guest. So I've seen a lot of that in my research journey, in my personal journey, and it's very exciting, and I'm excited to be here on this panel. And, you know, I do work for Coastal First Nations now as I'm finishing up my PhD, and it's really, so I'm just so thankful to see all of the hard work that is done by many nations on and off reserve. I mean, that's just a colonial construct for caring for our waters, be they saltwater, freshwater, anything like that. We don't have those kind of silos. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Joanne. Yeah. You know, I think it's really critical when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples to not forget about the populations that are in urban centers, because, you know, there's a lot of opportunities that stem from that. Our next speaker, Corey Douglas, knows this very well, coming from Squamish Nation. So, you know, Corey, you know, here in Vancouver, you know, we refer to Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations as host nations. You know, and we try to ground the work done in the city of Vancouver with host nations protocols. And so, you know, you as someone who is working on the Sea to City Design Challenge, seeing, I think, probably the gaps in knowledge from, you know, the city perspective and the Lower Mainland perspective, and just hearing how much leadership our northern communities are providing us in terms of coastal stewardship. What kind of changes do you think need to happen at the industry level, the collaboration required, and what does reconciliation look like through, you know, this coastal collaboration with First Nations, really stemming from the leadership that we've heard, you know, from our northern, you know, nations so far?
Good question, Ginger. You know, we're all family here. You know, at the end of the day, we're all family here on the coast, and, you know, how we can work together has been, you know, a top priority. You know, how do we gain knowledge, exchange information? You know, prior to contact, these relationships were strong. You know, we had family ties from community to community, and, you know, that disconnect is still evident today. But, you know, we are finding opportunities to work with, you know, the strong urban Indigenous community that we have here in East Van. Collaborative efforts are real, you know, and tangible on projects. Great initiatives are coming through in projects as pilot projects. You know, Sea to City has really kind of opened up my eyes, and, you know, I want to thank Angela and the teams for accepting, you know, my proposition to be as the lead cultural advisor on this project. And, you know, we've been able to establish a large number of questions through the process. You know, realizing that the foreshore was, you know, really a primary component to the challenge itself. But, you know, what does the urban footprint look like? How is it fastly encroaching on our foreshores? And what is the impact of our urban footprint? How can we reevaluate what you know, urban planning looks with our foreshore? And, you know, this was a really big question that we had to ask between both teams. And, you know, I'm very proud of the work that we've done to date. You know, pushing back said urban footprint and naturalizing the foreshore, increasing the possibility of reestablishing relationships with First Nations communities here in Vancouver, most notably Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and their long-standing relationship with that said foreshore. What can we bring as a strong cultural contribution to this space? And naturalizing that foreshore was the first tip of the hat. Again, falling back on these questions that we had come from our collaborative efforts really helped us kind of revitalize our commitment to what this potentially could look like in a collaborative way. Industry, if you look across Canada, and most notably here in Vancouver, and I've said this many times, I live downtown Vancouver, I walk through downtown Vancouver, and I'm a stranger in my own territory. There is very poor examples or best case examples of acknowledging host nations' culture when it comes to architecture, planning, interior design, landscape design. And this is part of the process. How can we best contribute to reconciliation in a collaborative effort with industry leaders? And Ginger, you and I are working on a number of different projects collaboratively to ensure that there's a strong presence in mind when we're not only acknowledging the host nations, but also acknowledging the urban Indigenous community. So we're working with architects, city planners, helping understand through these pilot projects, what is policy? How can we establish policy within these governing bodies to further commit to reconciliation? And also industry leaders like developers, architects, engineers, collaboratively, we need to better understand how to work best with them. Protocol, what is protocol? The non-Indigenous professional industry may not clearly understand these terms of reference. Decolonization, what does that mean to the industry? What does indigenization mean or indigenizing mean to the industry? What is the process? What is the appropriate process that we can best evaluate a project from beginning to end? And Ginger, you and I have, and probably most of us here have been called upon at the 11th hour to bring some form of cultural references to a project to establish a commitment to reconciliation. We're trying to better understand how we can be propositioned. When is the best appropriate time for engagement with First Nations representatives, communities, independent contractors, like maybe some of ourselves here. I try and make sure that I come in with most projects as a neutral cultural advisor. I want to establish, relationships with the industry, with the municipalities, and with the local First Nations communities. There's probably a lot more subject matter for me to kind of talk about here, but I don't want to take up the time that we have here because this is a shared space for all of us to talk about some of these subjects. Thank you, Ginger.
Do you mind if I weigh in, Ginger?
Please do, Chief.
So I want to thank the other speakers for bringing up the point of creating a space for the inclusion of our people. And, it's true, we have a pretty horrific history, and yet at the same time, our people are so generous with that knowledge. And it's almost paradoxical in some ways. And one of the gifts of insight and understanding is the necessity and the importance of being able to look backwards to move forward, to be able to understand. That's what our people, that knowledge bank of understanding natural systems, being in relationship with the natural resources. When we start our food harvesting cycle, it's called the Bakwala to us. That's to harvest food in a good way. Currently, we're doing an exhibition on that at Vancouver Science World, and also how all of the resources traditionally were harvested was by our people up and down this whole coast was through the ocean-going canoe. And there's different styles of canoe: northern style, Salish style, New Channel, West Coast style, river canoes. And that vessel helped to unify all of us. And our cultures evolved and our language evolved. And some of the most complex maritime Indigenous people on the planet evolved right here on the Pacific Northwest coast because of that abundance of resources that our people were able to harvest, and it wouldn't have been possible without the ocean-going canoe. And so those resources are the key to a healthy ecosystem. They're the biological indicator. We have to understand our relationship to them, because a lot of people don't have the context to see what plentiful looked like. And so what we're saying is that we have to kind of bring it back to these healthy systems, so that Vancouver can continue to be one of the most beautiful places in the world. It was cultivated by the Salish people. And we had commerce and trade through the ocean-going canoe. And we're telling that story through the Sacred Journeys exhibition, which will be at the head of Falls Creek. You're talking about the city of Vancouver and that intertidal zone and this hugely impacted region and the part of the city. And so there was questions that were asked about relationships and how can we engage. Well, I encourage you to go check out this exhibition. It's the canoes are gonna paddle in on July 14th, and then it will be there, the exhibition at Science World, until February 20th. Come and witness the canoes arriving. And then walk through that exhibition that tells not the Hillstock story, but all of our story along this coast. As I said, I think it's really important to have a really good understanding, because the nature of society it's transient now, and we're not connected to place. And if all our value is making money, then we have demonstrated that we have depleted the natural resources. But if we want to continue to be in place, then we have to protect those relatives. Like, that's what we say. And the Salish Sea region is a closed system. You know, you got Juan de Fuca down on the south side of Vancouver Island, or the Straits, where the water comes and goes. And there was scallops that grew, but because of ocean acidification, primarily because of the city, the populations in this region is having a devastating impact. And the thing is that these questions that were asked about how can we work together, and honestly, the resources of the sea and the land don't know any boundaries. They don't know municipal boundaries. They don't know city boundaries, or nation or global boundaries. We all have a responsibility to look after these resources for our future generations. It's imperative. And again, I'm grateful. I appreciate the inclusion, creating a space to have this dialogue about how we move forward, how we navigate together, how we pull together. That's the term we use. We pull canoe together, and we have different opinions, and we have to work together. And sometimes we're not comfortable, and we have to suffer. We have to work together, and we find our rhythm, and we start to move, but we got to agree. And I think that's a part of it is, there has been a certain level of arrogance toward our people. I mean, it's everywhere. It was legislated. There was legislated discrimination against our people. That's shifting, thank goodness. Now we have to say, well, how do we continue to create space to move forward, to pull forward in a good way for our future generations? And that's a value and an ethic, as much as take a little and leave a lot. But obviously things are changing, because in the cities, which are extracting the majority of the resources, that's a very challenging value to incorporate because of the population, and people aren't familiar with this ethic and value. So I just wanted to add that to the dialogue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Chief. One of the questions that we have in the Q&A from Brett is on some of the pilot projects that have been talked about, or I would say some of the projects talked about in general from both either the Sea to City or Coastal First Nations. Maybe I want to direct this towards, Christine first, to talk about some of the projects that Coastal First Nations has been working on that is really taking a lot of the knowledge and experiences that Chief Brown has been talking about and actualizing this into both the Indigenous Guardians program, which I don't think people here know quite much about, because I don't think we have, a high awareness of Indigenous Guardians here in the Lower Mainland. Like, I'm not sure if there are Indigenous Guardians connected to the coastal First Nations here in the southern part, and even the fish reconciliation agreement that has been struck as a means to let people know, like, where is this going?
Sure. I'll first talk about some of the relevant things that we've probably seen in the media in the last couple of days and even last week. As many of you know, Kitasoo Hehe, we were in Victoria, and their community and their stewardship people were there, and they were recognized and designated as Forest Ranger Authority. So previous to this, when they see poachers in their community, they see people that are fishing that that shouldn't be fishing, or going into the forest and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. All they were able to do before was sort of observe, write, and report. So it was that really amazing thing to witness Newhawk and Kitasoo be able to be recognized and have that authority. We have that authority inherently anyway. We tell them to leave our territory. We do all of those pieces. But this is just a sort of extra tool in that toolbox in order to protect their territories. And that was a pretty amazing thing to witness last week in Victoria. That was something that we were a part of. And then just yesterday, or actually just today, they announced that they're designating their own marine protected area within their own territories in order to protect their salmon and herring and all of those species within their territory. And we are involved in a process that is looking at these sort of marine protected areas, but they were in a crisis mode. They want to make sure that it's being protected going into this season. So, I think when we're talking about decolonizing these processes, it's really important to remember that our communities know that this is their territory. It is their responsibility to protect it. So is a good example of Kitasoo and Newhawk exercising their authority and being able to meet with the province to be able to talk about those pieces. What can help them, because there's nobody else in those. There's no forest rangers in our territories that are seeing all these poachers, and poachers know that, right? And so this is a good step. It's a pilot project, and we'll sort of be able to look back at that and be able to learn from it, and hopefully spread it to all the rest of our other stewardship offices. But the fish reconciliation, it was signed off last year. I think it was done by our 9 communities, and it's a really unique agreement. And it really was our communities coming together and trying to think of a way in which we can manage our territories, build sustainability within our communities, and provide economic opportunities for our communities, and also, be able to think about that component that we all think about is, how are we going to save the salmon and all the species that come along with that for the next generation? So that was the premise of the fish reconciliation. They got together, they came together, and they discussed it. And I think they came up with a pretty great framework for that. And it involves all of our communities. We're hoping it's built off of a Maori, it takes some of the pieces off of Maori They've developed a similar fish reconciliation, and it's actually one of the biggest fish companies in that country. And so we didn't want to reinvent. We wanted to make sure we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. We went back and took a look at some of the amazing components from that. And our hope is that we're developing a new economic opportunities and commercial fisheries for some of our nations. And then I think that having a new management regime that supports the best of all the science, that also allows us to co-manage our fisheries. And that's really important, that it's always been a sort of DFO making these decisions, and then we sort of are here saying, no, you can't make those decisions, and this is why. So with this new process, it's just getting off the ground. It is really will allow communities within the region to start having equal input as DFO. So it's not just DFO, it's DFO and our regional reps from our communities developing fish plans. And we're in a good position to do that because we have our stewardship offices that are collecting all this data that will inform those decisions moving forward. So I think it's we're figuring it out as we go along. It's no longer under Coastal First Nations. It's an entity of its own. Our job was to sort of get it up and going and ensuring that these agreements, ensuring that we talked to communities about what that meant. And it was quite a process to get to that place, but I think we're pretty excited. It provides support for business planning for our communities. Mentoring and access, as all of us know, coming from coastal communities, fishing is a dying industry in some species. So a lot of that training that would have went along with your children and grandchildren have in some communities fallen to the wayside. So we're really looking at sort of mentoring opportunities. And I think the biggest piece is looking at this regime of harmonizing what DFO, harmonizing is not the right word, looking at what DFO has to do, sitting at these tables and these decision makings, and then also with our communities, ensuring that they have all the accurate information. And I think that's been really sort of challenging part of this one, ensuring communities understand that they're not taking any of the rights and title or any of those pieces away from it. It is really about providing that opportunity, and it's a really exciting piece. It's in the community's hands now. They have a whole board structure. They have a governance piece that remains with Coastal First Nations. So we'll be setting up those tables and ensuring that that process is moving along. So, it's the one of a kind. We've had many First Nations contacting us saying, how did you guys do that? That is amazing. And being able to, we've shared a lot of that information as well, because we don't want to keep it to ourselves. We want to make sure that other communities understand this approach. And I think it's, we're at year one, and I think continuing to move along, that we're going to be in an amazing place. It's not just about the salmon. Some communities are deciding, no, we're going to buy those licenses and then put them away for a while as a form of them trying to conserve what fishing is happening in their community. So and it's also really focuses on the small vessel fishing for some of the communities. Some people will have a very small boat, but want to go out fishing and want to create some income for themselves, and this will allow for that. Mm-hmm. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Ginger.
Yeah, I think that the message that we're really getting is that First Nations self-determination, ability to be recognized through federal and provincial and we hope municipal authorities to grant First Nations that the permission to do what we're already doing on the coast, which is monitoring, assessing where coastal health, where fishing stock levels are at. Christine, when you talked about the fish reconciliation agreement, on how it really is a way for First Nations to take the power back, to collect all of the salmon commercial fishing licenses, and have agreement over how those, whether it's a good year to go fishing or not, whether it's okay to, welcome, fishing vessels into the waters. This is the message that we're really getting loud and clear, is that First Nations control over coastal management is really at the root of what we're hearing from each of you today. And we have a lot of questions in the Q&A right now. A lot of them are talking about how, how we can shift away from colonial structures, how we can, indigenize the work. I think what I want to stress to people is that we're really not going to see the changes that we want until we see First Nations governance recognized appropriately, with these abilities to monitor and be out on the waters and be along the foreshore, actively working with other levels of government in agreement on what that looks like, so that would really apply to anything for, the sewer overflows and the discharge that's going into the water. There's some questions around that. We're looking at, changes to federal and environmental assessment acts. None of this is actually an area that can be decolonized or indigenized, though, without the First Nations inherent rights and self-determination over the waters recognized, right? So, Corey and Joanne, coming from an urban context, a lot of folks are wondering about what this means for the city of Vancouver and what some of these concrete examples could be. I'm just wondering if there's anything else that you wanted to add to this. Corey.
Yeah, I think normalizing our involvement is going to play a big role. What is becoming normal? What does it mean to have a cultural consultant individual, cultural consultant team, and more importantly, establishing a safe place. There are variable levels of ignorance, if I can best describe it that way. Cultural understanding of history of who we are. I mean, the complexity of our coastline. I mean, how many people from Vancouver, BC, Canada know how many First Nations communities there are along this coastline? I've had a number of different workshops when I've asked that question, and commonly I hear 20 or 30. but again, I mean, this is a clear understanding of how uneducated tentatively our industry leaders are, how uneducated the general public is. And our role and responsibility is to help facilitate, manage, and educate through that process. And this is becoming what I'm hoping to establish to be a normalized opportunity when collaborating with industry, especially within the urban footprint. Respectfully, we're still seeing large development projects happen even within our own territory, being Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, and there's no formal engagement. So my job is to capture the attention of those industry leaders, and Ginger, you and I are trying to establish policy around that. What is that? How does that work with the city of Vancouver? And neighboring municipalities are trying to catch up. What does that look like for them? City of North Vancouver, how far behind are they? West or New Westminster, Surrey, Richmond, and not to put them, to point them out for their lack of whatever, but we're trying to find place here to establish relationships. Relationship building experience is a big part of the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We need to, crawl and walk before we can run. And I think the message is get knowledgeable over the lands that you're on, the work that's been done to date, and also push our governments to have these agreements with local First Nations for this co-management approach. Joanne.
Yeah, and I would say centering Indigenous ways of knowing, because there was a question about, you know, it was a very specific question about working for a nonprofit, and they're tied to, you know, these numbers, these reductions by a certain year, etc. I mean, those, you know, those serve their own purpose. I'm not gonna like totally tear that down, but also to meaningfully engage with Indigenous knowledge holders to determine what their visions and goals are. And I think a lot of nations like Squamish, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, they've been very, very generous in terms of sharing their land use plans and their culture in as much as they feel comfortable to on their online website platform. So you don't have to, you know, ask, you know, all of these overworked people working for nations for everything, you know, do some research, look online for some of these things, and really center that knowledge, not, you know, the Trudeau knowledge of, you know, we're going to reduce this by this and this by this. No, we're going to center Indigenous goals, Indigenous ways of knowing, especially for environmental NGOs. I think they have a lot of, there's been a lot of, I guess, a rough road between Indigenous people and certain environmental NGOs that, you know, just center us, center our knowledges. And I think Western science is only, you know, less than 1,000 years old, whereas our sciences, our technologies are millennia. You know, we have fish weirs, fish traps that are thousands of years old. We have clam gardens that we tend and maintain that are thousands of years old. We have crabapple orchards that have been tended to, and they're hundreds of years old. You know, like, we predate Western science. So I think, you know, Western science could really humble itself and learn from Indigenous people, as well as Corey's point of Coast Salish people. I've heard it before that many Coast Salish people feel like strangers on their own land. So actively looking at examples that welcome Coast Salish architecture and ways of knowing, so that people know that we as Indigenous people aren't in a museum. We're not all extinct, you know. And I think a lot of times that is still present, especially in urban areas, is just like, you know, we're a whisper in the wind until it's, you know, time to traipse us out for a powwow. Like, there's more to our cultures than that. Mm-hmm. And that's a little blunt. I see some people laughing, but yeah, there's just, there's a lot more to us than that. We are actively, like I said, practicing our culture on Coast Salish territory, and, you know, with Coast Salish people. Like, I've been so honored to bear witness to many Coast Salish like ceremonies and so forth. So yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, totally agree with you, Joanne.
Yeah, I mean,
Chief Brown.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Chief Brown, I see that you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, you know, there's quite a body of higher level drivers, such as, you know, legislated UNDRIP provincially and also federally, the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations. There's over 200 Supreme Court decisions that recognize title and rights, you know, so it's not only the rights, but the responsibility. Like, we're assuming the responsibility to do this work, to continue to do this work. And honestly, there isn't enough resources in federal and provincial treasuries for government agencies to do this. So it makes sense to invest in First Nations, for example, to support monitoring and compliance of development, because there was a request for some specific examples. You know, especially in the aquatic environment, I've seen some experiments happening around herring spawn. You know, like we know quite a bit about that because it's an important fishery to our community, and you know, we could support that work. I always go back to the necessity of these biological indicators, because if you don't have that, you got no terms of reference either way. You got historical knowledge. And so this isn't just about a feel-good thing. There's a legal underpinning of an obligation and a relationship. There's questions about like how do we engage in a decolonized way. I'm a member of the Indigenous Leadership Initiative as a senior advisor. You can go to their website, and there's a pretty good piece on how to be a good ally. Listen, you know, listen to the Native people. You know, they have something to say. A lot of times people just, you know, it seems to be a bit of a pattern where people are really aggressive and just fill that space. You know, listen, sit back and hear what our people have to say. And I know, like I worked as the founding director of our Integrated Resource Management Office, and as the director of Land and Marine Stewardship for Coastal First Nations. We set up the Stewardship Directors Network and set up the Coastal Guardian Training Program, Stewardship Technicians Training Program, in partnership with Vancouver Island University. All really good work that as Christine said, these are good models that can be transferred. You know, we're about a conservation-based development approach. It doesn't have to be all extractive. And if it is, it has to comply to ecosystem-based management, comply to that, you know, on the land use side and the marine use side, so that we're looking at sustainable yields for species instead of continuing the status quo of boom and bust. I think in the urban setting, it creates its own challenges, but I think also that's where, again, the majority of the political and economic power rests. But it's also a big problem, because that's what's hurting our ecosystem. And if you could imagine traveling back in time, it's when you go to areas that aren't as impacted, then that's your biological indicator. And if you could say, okay, this is what it looks like in its natural cycle, like the Bacola, as we move through the seasonal round, then that's the benchmark to inform our public policy, or, you know, as it relates to sustainability in the aquatic environment. We know there's going to be significant investments into urban guardians. There's talk of that, and investments for, so this isn't like there's going to be no resources to support that process. And it should be the three host nations, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam, that, you know, are working collaboratively with other governments and building capacity to do that work. I think going back to the land and to the water, because our children aren't going to fight for it if they're not in relationship with it, if they're disconnected from it. You know, I think that really matters, to nurture that in our children so that they'll maintain those values of the importance of this relationship to not only our food, but the spiritual and emotional well-being that it gives to us as people, and our place in the world, our sense of identity. And I think that's very important, because our biodiversity directly mirrors cultural diversity. And if that erodes, then we are all poorer for it. Mm-hmm. And so I think that the Native people of this land are being extremely reasonable and being patient and saying, hey, you should really consider this.
Yeah. Yep, you're right. If we have an indicator where we see Indigenous people engaging in relationship with their land and water, that's probably a pretty good indicator that we're going to see this management and co-management take place in a much stronger way, hopefully complete recognition by all levels of government, so that they're not making decisions in isolation from First Nations aspirations. I recognize that we're really close to the end of our time together, and I wanted to give everyone, like, can you say 30 seconds? Like, so generally, you know, it's nice to end on, like, what is something that you're working on that you're looking forward to, you know, that is really going to change the work that we're doing for shoreline management. And I know, Christine, you wanted to jump in, so I'll let you, you know, take your final words, focused on whatever you want. But, you know, we can look at like what's the North Star that we're working on right now, that you're working on?
I think the one thing I'd like to leave with everybody is that the best outcomes of any agreement, any work that you're doing, is in partnership with First Nations. And we found that at Coastal First Nations with all of our communities, these agreements, and why we're so successful is that they are in partnership with our communities. We bring in the province, we bring in the feds, and we're even bringing in big corporations to help us do all of that work, because we can't do it alone. So I think it's a little bit more work. It does provide more meetings, but also don't inundate First Nations communities with all of these things that you want to do, because they're so busy trying to sort of maintain their territories, their communities. So be thoughtful in how you approach them. And I think the last piece is that, you know, we're looking at innovative ways. We're looking at blue carbon initiatives. We're just up in Haida Gwaii and Kitasoo doing some extractions of sediments up there. So, you know, look for that. I think coming out of our communities, we're trying to find ways to build an economy that's not based on extractive industry. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you. Corey, 30 seconds or less.
Ooh, where do I start? I don't know. Yeah, I think collaborative efforts is required here. How can you bring something that we're working on? So it's having multi-generational kind of opportunities. You know, we're constantly looking to support this growing requirement of having Indigenous people partake in these kind of projects, whether it be through employment within the nation or standalone independent contractors like myself. Capacity building.
Thank you, Corey. Joanne.
Yeah, I think centering Indigenous ways of knowing and just, you know, being open to what things would look like when you're trying to work with Indigenous people, like really make that a priority of building that meaningful partnership and meaningful relationship with Indigenous communities, and keeping in mind that Indigenous communities aren't defined by like an on-off reserve dichotomy. Like we're everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And Chief, final words to you.
I encourage everybody that's witnessing this call, this panel, to come out and invest in yourself by taking time to check out these exhibitions. As I mentioned, the food piece, Bakwala, learn about that. Also come to Science World and witness the canoes arriving on July 14th to learn about the history and the culture of the First Peoples, because we do land acknowledgements when we come into other people's territory, ask permission to come ashore and share who we are. We recognize that we are guests transiting through other people's territories. And that's a total gesture of respect. And I think that's the key. We have to respect each other. We have to hold up that Indigenous voice, create space for that Indigenous voice to have its meaningful place in society. But we also have to recognize our truth before we can reconcile. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Chief Brown, Christine, Joanne, Corey, Angela, everyone for joining us today. This will be shared with all of you shortly. We had a number of questions that we were able to get to. Also a number of questions that we weren't able to get to, but hopefully we were able to answer them in a high level way. I think really the message is that the more support we can encourage our elected officials to engaging with First Nations on a government to government basis, really utilizing, as Christine was saying, First Nations as the hub to bring all levels of government and stakeholders together, as opposed to us going through, you know, a federal or a provincial silo, is something that would benefit all of us. And of course, there's a lot of work that we need to do as we enter into planning for sea level rise and ensuring that we don't desecrate important habitats for salmon or other species in the process, that we not continue our Wild West approach to development without consideration of what's important to Indigenous communities. So thank you, all of you, for joining us today. This recording will be available for all of you to watch again. Thank you. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. It is also National Indigenous Peoples Month. Please, I encourage you to go out and see the Bacoas and the Sacred Journey projects that Frank was working on. Thank you all. Take care.